Bank Museum, um, the Massachusetts Horticultural Society. And I've done a lot of work with organizations like Slow Food to try to meld the ways of history into things that are pertinent for our backyards, things that we can learn from and adapt and have fun with. Um, so when Timber Press asked me to write a book about garden history, I felt like we're looking at history very differently right now. And I didn't want to write another book about the homesteads and landscapes we've heard about, but really the old ways in gardening, things that our grandparents and great great grandparents knew, plants that were familiar from First Nations people right through every generation of immigrant that followed afterwards. And so they were very gracious in letting me write this book, which came to be called The Heirloom Gardener: Traditional Plants and Skills for the Modern World. And so, what I'd like to do tonight is take you on a little bit of a tour of the essays of the book, threading together some of the things that I think are an important theme that runs through the book about really making a difference one backyard at a time, and in ways that I think also help improve our quality of life in the process. Every gardener knows, too, that every spring's a new chance to start fresh with things. And so to me, that's always been an important turning point that we just hit last weekend with the spring equinox. And with that, I think there's a chance that we're getting back into gardens. And that's a really, to me, a thing I miss deeply in the winter. And I feel like for a lot of us, the gardens have been a huge refuge over the past several years. I think we've gone through a lot in recent years. And now coming out the other side of the pandemic, I hope into spring, this still holds up. This is a woodcut from Mary Azarian that I've always loved. It says, "When the world wearies and ceases to satisfy, there's always a garden." And I really try to use that as an anchor throughout the whole book, really, about how we can meld personal and environmental well-being just in our backyard, and focusing on what we plant as making for better communities and habitat where we live. So one of the threads that runs through the whole book is a sense of place. You know, we all live in or grew up in different places, and just a sense of place, the way that our landscapes speak through their history and the remnants that are there make a huge difference to me in the way I look at a landscape. Every house I've ever lived in, I can see, old stone walls that in this region used to run between fields and pastures, or old wells, maybe some of the native plants like Mahakashin flower or lady slipper as we came to know it. Where I grew up, I was along this place called the North River, and a shipyard was right at the foot of the hill where I grew up that hadn't been in use since the late 19th century, but you could tell how that landscape was used in so many ways. And I've always really liked getting that sense of what I'm layering on top of when I plant my gardens and landscapes, and how I can help respect what was there before me. There's a native writer, Linda Hogan, who wrote, "Walking, I'm listening to a deeper way. Suddenly, all my ancestors are behind me. Be still, they say, watch and listen. You are the result of the love of thousands." And in my landscape, I could tell how many people had nurtured that space before me. And not just people, but I grew up in Fox Hill. Every spring, generations of foxes would come rolling down the hill, and that was as much a part of the place as the huge shipbuilding nails and other artifacts we'd find out in that land. So that same sense of our own landscape's history is something the Irish would have called tenalach, or the relationship one has with the land, the air, the water, and a deep connection that makes you at one with nature. In Japan, they write about Shinrin Yoku, or this whole idea of forest bathing with a new scientific understanding that even just the essential oils that trees put off or the microbes in the soil make an enormous difference in our personal well-being. And so when we can find ways to help the landscapes of place sing, it makes a huge difference. Where I live right now, it's maple syruping time, and everybody's, getting to the tail end of it now, but those buckets have been up on trees for a while now. And that's a defining characteristic of spring here. The red-winged blackbirds returning to the marsh, or the bluebirds coming around and eating the staghorn sumac berries that no other bird would eat in the fall, but they wait until spring when they need those fatty oils. So it's that finding a place and celebrating the plants of the place, like the sumac or the wintergreen berries that you'd find in the woodland areas. Finding your own historic landscapes, like the railroad depot there, and ways that they tell us stories of the past and how people used the landscape in the past and how it shaped the landscape we live in today. Rachel Carson, who wrote several wonderful books that really helped reshape our thinking about the environment, Silent Spring being the chiefest among them, wrote that if a child is to keep their inborn sense of wonder, they need the companionship of at least one adult who can share it, rediscovering with them the joy, excitement, and mystery of the world we live in. I think these days we're seeing such a disconnect with the outdoors. And if you can think back to the first person that ever taught you to fall in love with gardening or the love of a particular plant or place in the landscape, none of us ever few of us just wandered into it and loved going out to garden or be in nature. But when you think back to that first person that introduced you, it really becomes evident that we need to be also engaging others out there. This is an old hollowed out apple tree, still alive, but mostly for my neighbor's kids playing in it. This is a kid playing in one of the children's gardens that I designed for the Massachusetts Horticultural Society. Just true joy. And I think that's part of what we need to be making sure we spark in youth today. So one of the things that I write about, which is an age-old skill, an old way for gardeners, is to make herbaria. An herbarium, which is the singular of herbaria, is a collection of pressed botanical specimens. Like this is a page from Emily Dickinson's herbarium. And they'd slide the stems through or put tape over them to secure them into a book of bound specimens. And then I've seen them in collections. This one's algae that a kid in Florida sent back to his sister for Christmas, many, many states away. Emily Dickinson's. This is in a university collection, but most often they'll write the common and Latin name if they knew the Latin name, but also how the plant might be used and any other facts that they could bring together around that plant and its cultivation. So it really became a way to learn the most you could about place, but it also helped you become a household botanist in many ways, making sure that you knew the plants that you were also likely going to use as food and medicine and reconnect. And I think that's especially important today for the same reason that it was important for kids in the 19th century when botanizing was so popular. Similar reason, I should say, because in the 19th century, we had kids off in factories working, and we knew we needed to reconnect them to nature. These days, they're behind cell phones. So one of the things we're finding is an epidemic in the country is that on average, kids are said to know fewer than 10 animals and plants in their own backyard, but that they'll know hundreds and hundreds of corporate logos. And that's part of why I think gardening is such an important thing that we make sure we take time to engage our kids in. Because really, if we look at every one of our backyards as a chance to build habitat, we bring meaningful connections back to life, whether it's for our kids and their sense of discovery, having fun out in nature, or just seeing how really fabulous nature is when you leave some areas in meadows so that you're getting fireflies and June bugs and whippoorwills and tree toads at this time of year. It's leaving the kind of habitat that makes sure that because you left some leaf duff down in your yard, you're going to have salamanders. But also by making sure we're planting a lot of natives in the mix, you'll see, when you plant the native lobelia, you're going to get the native hummingbirds. When you plant something like mountain mint, well, we did a citizen science project with kids at one of the places I worked, and we counted 17 different native pollinators on that mountain mint at one time, and honeybees. So that, there are plant choices that can help us make a big difference. Things like spice bush or sassafras to get you this really cool caterpillar, the spice bush swallowtail caterpillar that looks like it's got big eyes looking at you, or even plants like jewelweed that help us keep from getting poison ivy. Whole families used to go out and interact. And I think that's the other way we rediscover what it means to be in habitat. We find models around us. And if you're out foraging for blackberries, as you're seeing somebody do there, maybe you bring home a few canes of blackberries and you plant them so that you're helping to build some of the same habitat instead of just going out and over harvesting. And really, some of that is so easily doable. When I was a kid, we didn't have weed whackers knocking down every bit of meadow ground. We left we left open space where things like milkweed and asters could grow, butterfly weed could flourish. A lot of the smaller shrub layer with native fruits like viburnum or winterberry. Until I planted some winterberry in my yard, the Ilex verticillata, I'd never seen a bluebird here where I live. And that winter, I put a bunch of branches into an urn outside my front door, and a dozen bluebirds came in the middle of a snowstorm and picked them clean. And the nice thing is, when you're leaving these things for wildlife, they're also pooping it out somewhere else, reseeding native populations of things like winterberry. And then suddenly the habitat is more protected, and you start to see things like the ruffed grouse or partridge come back in. And you're remembering that all of this is a community too, a community that we used to know, that we lived very closely with and intimately with. So in any landscape that I think about, I try to incorporate a lot of indigenous horticulture, whether that means the plants that grew out and around gardens, like Joe Pye weed, a wonderful pollinator plant, or New England asters, or so many of the just beautiful plants and medicinal plants, but also crops like beans, corn, and squash. They have been grown for well over 1,000 years in native gardens. There was a sort of different approach to gardening and, I shall say, horticulture and agriculture between these native and European models. But the biggest difference is the European models were monocultures. You grow in a whole field of barley, a whole field of what they would call barley corn and wheat corn, and another of peas corn, and another of rye corn. But among indigenous populations, this idea of planting a genetically diverse crop with beans, corn, and squash meant that you got 3 crops in the same space. And we know, pound for pound, it yields the highest, it produces the highest yield of any other method known in the world today. It's a completely nutritionally balanced diet, and all 3 of them can be eaten fresh or overwintered. So that's pretty ingenious crop. But then you also had plants like groundnut, Apios americana, that has this really cool legume-like flower and these edible tubers that are delicious. And plants like sunchoke that also provided edible tubers that you could dig up in the early spring before they grew up again, or you could harvest after frost in the autumn. So all of this led to a sophisticated type of horticulture being practiced already. And then all of that's been layered upon. And so whether it was a native person foraging or you and I foraging growing up, foraging has a long history that's been practiced. This is a whole community out chestnutting, picking American chestnuts in the 19th century. This is my friend Kathy Gunst when we were doing a story for NPR on ramps or wild leeks. Um, these days it sounds like something that's in the domain of Brooklyn hipsters, but really, if you were to think about it, we probably all grew up foraging. We probably all went out picking blueberries or strawberries or rasps. Some families go out after mushrooms, others old naturalized fruit trees, black walnuts, or sometimes earlier on American chestnuts, hickory nuts, and rose hips, and even spices like the sumac that gives you that one seed head has 500 times the vitamin C of an orange. So all of this was our food and our medicine. And so my book also gets into ideas of best practices for foraging, some fun histories around it, and ways to make it more accessible for people who maybe didn't really think they had already known how to forage, but already kind of did have a clue. And so I also take that into the realm of certain plants that I also feel that instead of going out to gather, sometimes you can also do well to cultivate in your own backyard. The fiddleheads that were eaten in my region for thousands of years, are a plant that you can easily get at a garden center and grow out in your shade gardens. And when they're happy, they'll grow anywhere, sun or shade. It's this beautiful, stately, tall, shade loving plant. But these fiddleheads are the first edible green of spring around here. And it's going to be fiddlehead season soon. They're kind of like the moxie of greens. They're just a pungent but really delicious woodland flavor to me. So sometimes it's writing about things like that and having some fun with them, but really exploring many of the old ways that linked us with good practices for things like overwintering some of the plants that we really want to grow, but maybe it's too cold there to grow a fig or an olive or a pomegranate or a rosemary, something that simple even. So ways to overwinter plants, maybe to espalier fruits, because we're living in ever smaller urban yards like they were when they were first popular, or building vine teepees that are a fun way to grow vertically and gain space in a garden, but also get kids involved and playful in the same space. It's how to build hotbeds and cold frames, raised beds, and really come together around the table with all the things that each season yields for our gardens and the cool tools that we can use in carrying those crafts out. It's also looking at some of the historical movements that were so important in the evolution of our country as gardeners. Right now, especially during the last 2 years of pandemic, we now have as many gardeners in America gardening as we did during the Victory Garden movement of World War II. And I think that's really a significant shift. It's just a reminder of how much people understand the need to get their hands back in the soil, plant a little food security as well. And then when you do that, like every generation that followed after the Victory Garden, you remember what a true tomato, hot and ripe from the sun, tasted like. And maybe you never go back to the cellophane wrapped supermarket version. History showed us so many different movements. The school garden movement, when we realized that a lot of kids really had lost those skills and needed them to go back into productive lives as adults and parents. Generations of immigrants. This is a Ukrainian Jewish immigrants home and garden where I'd also created heirloom gardens for one of the museums I worked in. And that whole idea of seed saving within generations and household botany, using those things, canning what you could, and really making sure your yard was a productive space. they're all ways that we get passed down, like that heirloom tomato, that are important for preservation's sake. Thomas More wrote, "The ordinary arts we practice every day at home are of more importance to the soul than their simplicity might suggest." You know, when I saw this painting, I immediately saw my grandmother, and I could just remember so many hours sitting on porches and piazzas, topping and tipping beans or whatever the equivalent was. And, you know, those are the things that, you know, we believe we're getting so much with convenience today, but it's almost like a meditation. We pay for experiences today, and a lot of it would be to just find a community and sit and do something like that. Um, but it's also just that reminder that maybe if we had more conversations around green beans instead of red and blue, we'd be finding more common ground too. It's important to be able to sit with everybody, find common threads. And I think that's another thing our gardens are great at, is helping us find some common ground, because really we all do care about many of the same things. Another thread that runs throughout the whole book is this idea of heirloom. And in the instance of seeds, you should be very proud that your library and your state have incredible seed saving programs. But heirloom seeds and plants are really, we're at a critical juncture with them, and they really need our help with preservation and stewardship. We used to have seed houses in every community. This is a seedsman's chest at the New Hampshire Farm Museum. And just with that one traveling seedsman's chest, there were 17 different seed houses between two states. After World War II, the chemical companies bought up most of the seed companies, or they just got run out of business, because the idea came that hybrids were being created that were genetically superior. And there are some that are hybridized for great reasons, but a lot of them had been hybridized so that you could patent and own that seed. And what happened is, as chemical companies were investing into agribusiness out in the Midwest, we forgot what it meant to have the apple that your community was famous for, or the winter green that helped my community get through winters. The plants that really were of place, and more important than plants that could be harvested all at the same time, shipped 200 miles and gas to turn them red. So there's that whole legacy. So heirloom plants, by their nature, have been passed down through at least 3 generations. They're open pollinated, so that they are genetically diverse and you can save their seeds. Hybrids are genetic clones and you can't effectively save their seeds. So it really is something that has been our inheritance that we've been given, and people took centuries and centuries to, as my own grandfather would do, save the first tomato that came in, the sweetest one, the one that didn't crack. And then the next spring, he'd peel those seeds off the side of the brown paper bag and he'd plant them. And that's all it took. And if anybody ever tells you seed saving is more complicated than that, I think they want to discourage you from seed saving. It really is something plants were accustomed to doing by just dropping on the ground. So in every community I've ever worked, in every museum and public garden I've worked for, I try to find the seeds of place. Like for you in your town's seed library, it'd be really cool if you can tell me about a few seeds that you know were famous in your region someday. This is one that was stitched up in brown paper with milkweed twine, and they were called cranberry beans. And so by the time our slow food chapter got things going there, it was the bean that every restaurateur wanted to feature, every farmer was growing, and every farmer's market brought back. And in the Victory Garden that I restored at that same museum, that was the last time it had been grown in the neighborhood. Even though it had been grown there for 1,500 years, we lost it since World War II. So it was bringing back, rematriating something that had been a part of that neighborhood for over 1,000 years. And part of what's helping that happen is the resurgence of small integrated farms. If every farm out there is a 3,000 acre monoculture, they don't take chances on something that isn't going to ship for a few thousand miles or have a 3 month shelf life. But the small farmer finds niche markets where they can grow things where people really cared about flavor and nutrition and regionality. And so, and sometimes, those are things that can affect the whole region's economy. And in so many places that I've traveled in the States and in the world, these local agribusinesses are revitalizing local economies. I love when John Muir wrote that when we try to pick anything out, anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. When we had smaller farms, we had more than just the diversity of crops. We had, greens, we had nuts and fruits, we had links to clean energy, homegrown seed, grass-fed livestock that was then turning manure right back into the same land. And a lot of that is coming back and is really part of what I think of as the new industry, the new face of industry in America. And it's really been doing a lot to revitalize communities all around me. As have the farmers markets. Michael Pollan says that they are the new community gathering spaces in America. And it's been remarkable to watch. When I hold my head in my hands, thinking about the state of the world some days, I have to remind myself that, we also have watched farmers markets grow back from fewer than 2,000 20 years ago to well over 20,000 today. And now even more of these local farms are putting up farm stands if they, and maybe don't even get to farmers market because it's getting more and more common to find local farms coming back. And these farmers markets are a place, again, where you really find a different quality of food. When I remember watching TV as a kid and I'd see somebody, like I'm just thinking, like, you couldn't find mushrooms that weren't from a can. You couldn't find olives that weren't from a can. You couldn't find spinach that wasn't from a can. And while I'm sure it was really cool that you could eat something out of a can in the middle of winter for the first people that got it, the first people that got to eat fresh produce again after that period were really reminded how lucky we are to be getting back our farmers markets. And those of us that have always gardened have also known what that flavor of fresh means. It's also a great chance to have another one of those niche markets be organic gardening. It's the largest market share of any other method of gardening in America, almost 15% of the market share, I understand. And it's another craft. It's not something, I don't like telling people how they should do things, but I think most people I know don't want to poison the earth or their groundwater or their kids or their pets. But we learned better living through science meant using a lot of chemicals. And, in our own lifetimes, over 70% of the agricultural chemicals that were once used have been quietly taken off the markets because of toxicity issues. So it's a really great thing to share the old skills, the old ways for organic gardening so that we have more alternatives. It can be as simple as composting or, yesterday afternoon, bringing some seaweed that had washed up the river in front of my house or, back out into my garden. It's learning not just organic gardening as a matter of not putting chemicals in, but also what you can do regardless, getting deep rooted plants and working with xeriscapes and the native plants that really want to thrive where you live instead of having to put in irrigation, maybe building in concepts like food forests where they provide a lot of their own shade and they create transitional environments for biodiversity to thrive in. And so my book also gets into elements like that help guide us to, as this suggests, try organic food, or as your grandparents called it, food. And if you are what you eat, it's pretty great when you don't have to eat food that's you wear a hazmat suit to grow or that grows up in environments like this. Science is helping us understand as well that food that's organically grown can have as much as 70% greater nutritional value than food grown by current market standards. Um, Anytime we get something as close to ripeness, it makes an enormous difference. And as well, learning more and more about pesticide residues. Um, it's just another wonderful way to explore how you are what you eat and how growing your local community can make a difference. I want all of you to think back to the pandemic and how it might have shifted the way you live. For me, I re-enlivened some vegetable gardens that I kind of let go of when my parents were passing. And I got them started up again. Cold frames, hot beds, compost is all more active again. I started making salads with whatever I could find in my yard on a given day so that I didn't have to go out. Got back to snapping more beans with the pod that I kept company in, and more to eating my own backyard. And really, for so many of us, our gardens became our kitchen gardens again. So there were old models for how kitchen gardens would be built and how they could appear. Um, a lot of my work has been in restoring gardens in different periods or recreating them. This is one from the oldest house on Nantucket. I did similar things at Plymouth Plantation, but they can also be as elaborate as this modern Belgian kitchen garden. The main thing is your kitchen gardens are right outside your kitchen door so that every day you interact with them. And, maybe you see a lot of mint and a lot of parsley and you think, all right, I'll make tabbouleh tonight, or got a lot of basil and a lot of tomatoes. You can call that supper on a good night, or whichever greens you might need to harvest. And best of all, we get kids engaged in the process. And it gives us activities to do instead of paying to go to a gym or driving in a car to get somewhere and complaining about oil prices and gas prices, but finding joy in our little plot of ground at home where sometimes we've had to make the best of staying. So throughout, I tried to just tie all of these things together as the craft of gardening, whether it's building that raised bed or knowing how to turn compost into it, how to save your seeds and how to trellis, how to build a hotbed, how to use traditional tools of gardening, but also how to can and how to overwinter, how to tap a maple tree, but also really the skills that were just integrated through centuries and centuries of lore. Most of the recipes that are handed down to us for things like sage, like you see depicted here, um, any traditional recipe you could think of, I could probably tell you why it has ingredients in it, because most of these things, the more we learn about their scientific makeup, the more it tells us about how they work medicinally or how they help for food safety and food preservation. Sage, as a great example, is something that was in every recipe for stuffing, which the first immigrants here would have called belly pudding. But today we know it's it's antibacterial and antiseptic. And so the first place you would see bacteria form is in the cavity of a bird. So it just always went into that stuffing. And it's knowing skills like that made gardening a craft where you really did get older and wiser. You retained these ways, and it was a part of passing it along every day in the work you did together through the changing seasons of a garden. It said that a man who works with his hands is a laborer. A man who works with his hands and his head is a craftsman. But a man who works with his hands and his head and his heart is an artist. And I think it's great to find a little of our own artistic selves in the garden. The last 4 years, I've been working as the executive director for a garden called Bedrock Gardens in New Hampshire. It's becoming a new public garden for the state. And there's art integrated throughout that space. And what it's helped remind me of is that it's like another room of our house. it's great to be decorating out in our yards with the art that graces our lives. And sometimes we've got too many things in our house, and it's good to move some of them out anyways. It's taking those old skills like grafting so that you might have a cool orchard with slips of an old important tree in your neighborhood. Things like that that become a craft that we can learn and teach to others as well. And it's also really working to make our home a little bit more like a homestead. During the pandemic, I know so many people that started raising chickens or guinea fowl or quail, bees for sure. A lot of people taking up beekeeping, some neighbors with goats. And all of that is another part of how we used to just keep a small homestead farm. And it really contributed to our quality of life. And, having that tool shed where you can grow things out, it could be elaborate as you wanted or as simple as you wanted. These are some schematics from the 1940s on how to take a portion of your yard and make it a productive landscape that you can enjoy, or have it partnered alongside with a recreational part of your landscape, but finding the means to do that. And remember that that's going to connect to your neighbors. Maybe take a windy day like today and hang out some laundry instead of running a dryer. Um, there is a meditation in working from home that I think a lot of us kind of rediscovered when pandemic hit and we couldn't always get into our workplaces. And I think that's a part of what I was trying to write about too, is reclaiming the parts of that that we liked so that we can continue to carry them into our future, whether we're doing it for our Wednesday night dinner or because we decided we want to be a local brewer, or make kimchi for the markets. It's also these fun skill sets that come of just using the things that you get from your yard. I was pruning my apple trees yesterday. And so, like with coppicing and pollarding, you get water sprouts on your apple trees, your fruit trees. So I started weaving wattle beds, old style, round beds like this next to my raised beds yesterday, so that instead of buying a cheap plastic fence from a box store that's going to end up in a dump 2 or 3 years from now, I've got something that's going to last just as long, but I can keep adding to on the top every year, and finding a way to also make a landscape so much more beautiful, whether it's a simple arbor that you make, or a peony cage, or a raised bed, a fence, or an arbor. They're all traditional ways to build from whatever. It could be the free fall that comes down after heavy winds like tonight's. And it's also doing what your state has always done really well, which is growing a lot of fruits. In addition to large orchard fruits like apple, a lot of smaller yard fruits, like you can get the dwarf varieties for sure as well, but blueberries, quince, one of my favorite fruits of all, currants and gooseberries, now that we know what is safe to grow, elderberry, both for flavor as well as medicine, tart cherries, even pawpaws, which are the largest of our American fruits, cranberry, which you can grow in a garden just as readily as a bog, and things like raspberry and blackberry, all part of what we can be introducing so that, again, our yard becomes more of a habitat, something that we can eat and forage from, but that we also can share with wildlife instead of putting up a bird feeder. My birds get all they need from the plants around my yard. It's also exploring ideas of herbs and herbalism, and how, when we know our gardens a little bit more deeply, we're better able to use plants in a way that, as Dioscorides would say, first do no harm. If you know from your garden that you can make a cup of fennel tea and your upset stomach's going to go away, or chamomile tea or mint tea, that's a great first way to start. Wendell Berry says herbalism is based on the relationship between plant and human, plant and planet, human and planet. Using herbs in the healing process means taking part in an ecological cycle. And there's a whole wellness to that as well. We lose a lot in a pharmaceutical industry that would try to turn kale into a pill as soon as they realized it was a huge part of new economies. It only took but a year for them to realize, selling that pill, that it didn't do anything, because honestly, sometimes you just need to eat your damn roughage right from the garden. And so our plants, our herbs teach us that it's, they're far more chemically complex than the constituents we render from them and replicate for a patent medicine. And like that kale, when we can garden and get that whole plant represented, whether it's in a salad we eat or a wintergreen oil we put on an achy joint, or a cup of tea, they all are ways that give us inroads to knowing our herbs and plants. And like foraging, maybe it all sounds again like something for Brooklyn hipsters, but we all grew up with herbal medicine. Maybe garlic for your immune system, or echinacea, an orange or a tomato for vitamin C, an apple a day to keep the doctor away, carrots for your eyes, spinach for iron in your blood, beets for your blood, or ginger ale, chamomile tea for an upset stomach, or just prunes to keep you regular. We all grew up knowing that plants really were medicine, but we lived in an age where we were paying more attention to the companies that were teaching us their logos than maybe our grandparents for a few generations. And so now this is all reemerging. And we can borrow from some of these traditional plants and learning techniques, like the sage that I mentioned, or, wasabi. You would never eat raw fish in Japan without having wasabi, because it's a vermifuge. It would keep you from getting intestinal worms from eating raw fish. Plants like St. John's wort that we knew were good for emotional well-being, and the blood, or the sanguine humor, made a medicine that was the color of blood that reminded you of that. Borage for courage. They had simple ways built in to remind you of a medicine's properties. If it had a name like lady's mantle or lady's bedstraw or motherwort, told you it was for woman's health. Comfrey, as we call it today, was called knit bone, and today we know it regenerates cellular growth. So different ways of expressing it, but ways of making sure we passed information down through the ages, like this one, mugwort. One of the first poster children for local economies and agritourism was craft beer. And mugwort was one of those traditional brewing herbs that, like ale cost and ale hoof, told you just in their very name that they were some of the seasonal herbs you brewed with. Long before hops became a regular part of beer, we were brewing with spruce tips and sage and bog rosemary and all kinds of plants that really brought seasonal flavors to what had been a seasonal beverage. But hops was a good preservative, and so it took over. But what we're reminded of today is that there's a market for seasonal flavors, for fresh brews, instead of something that can last in a can for 6 years, but something where you can taste that difference and have fun at a local bar that you can walk home from. And so the craft beer has been a part of this. Also making cordials and cocktails. The elderberry I talked about growing in your yard, it's one of my absolute favorites to make what, where I live, we call cordials. And I think when you live through a winter as cold as either of us have, it helps make you cordial. But we also know today that elderberry is antiviral, so it's a good support medicine. It's also good for bronchial passages. And so, again, a good medicine to take through winter. These are some fun cocktails we made. This is a sumac and rose petal, rose sugar rim, and they were just great cocktails that we made at Celia Thaxter's garden for an Eco-Culinary Institute we hold each year. But putting up these fun things so that we can remember summer, even in the middle of winter. And as Thoreau wrote, we need the tonic of wildness. And so I also write about tonics and bitters, things we can make from the plants in our garden, like bee balm, that are fun to play with in this kind of cocktail culture. And so, anyways, that and teas also figure into chapters there, as well as just the idea of getting back to living seasonally and celebrating with those traditions. When your lavender's blooming, which is big out your way too, making lavender wands and remembering that our ancestors did that because it perfumed their linens, but it also kept the bed bugs out of their drawers. Most things are layered like that. There's a real connection to the medicinal and the fragrant and the flavor profiles of different herbs and plants, that go into why we made them into these craft things. The maple syruping and how to tap and put by that. Working with seasonal crops like rhubarb and strawberry or sweet Sicily when it comes up in spring, so that each season really is distinct in flavor and look. So I tossed this in. It's one of the things like spring equinox that I also wrote about, that ties into the book, and just traditional holidays and celebrations. Like on May Day, you'd make May wine with plants like sweet woodruff and maybe some rose petals. Kids made May baskets and they'd sneak them at their neighbors' doors and take off. We had maypoles and people going out maying. It was said in parts of England the streets were strewn so thickly with flowers you couldn't see the street for the flowers on May Day. But for most people, it also meant just reconnecting with plants from your garden, like sorrel, to make sorrel soup as one of your first greens, or asparagus from those first spears in the garden each year. It's also making seasonal reeds and other artifacts from each time of year, whether it's a winter cone wreath or an autumn wreath like this 18th century painting, or one of the solstice wreaths that I like to make every winter when I save all my pruning projects or the fun stuff to rebuild wreaths that remind us of the old design in a wreath, that it was a wheel of life, to remind us that no matter what, we just keep cycling through the seasons over and over and over again until we're done. But also remembering the sweetness in life too. The old herbalists would say that the flowers are the sweetest essence of the plant, and they would never waste them. They put them into cheeses and butters and ice cubes and salads and honeys and vinegars. When your lawn was producing a ton of violets, you'd make a violet syrup or violet jelly, chive vinegar, or maybe you just eat Solomon's seal by the fistfuls because the flowers taste so good. And it's reconnecting with the language that our gardens taught for generations. Because when you really have had your ear to the ground for generations, there are so many lessons embedded there. So I also like to have fun with the old idea of the language of flowers. It was kind of used like emojis today, and every flower had its specific meaning, and you'd send little token posies or tussy mussies, the same way you'd send an emoji to say how you were feeling. And then on the flip side, it also gets into other essays like the one on lawn, where I really explore how we were taught we needed to keep a yard in order to put forward our best face in a community, but then also recognizing that we've outgrown some of those ideas of our lawn being a status symbol, and maybe just coming to realize it's an environmental suck, it's a status suck, a time suck. It's also a place that can be much more beautiful and beneficial when you let some of it go back to meadow, some of it be biodiverse like this that can actually support pollinators as well. Not saying any one right way, but exploring different ways that we can approach these things. And then looking at some of the plants within our lawns that we might be considering useful plants like dandelion instead of cursing them. E.B. White wrote, I would feel more optimistic about a bright future for man if he spent less time proving that he can outwit nature and more time tasting her sweetness and respecting her seniority. When I leave the milkweed in my yard, it flows over to my neighbor's yard and ultimately across to your yards. And each of us really does have a chance to make that kind of difference by growing what we're growing, where we're growing, or just leaving room for the native layers to come back through. When I left the Joe Pye weed and the ironweed and the eupatorium and spirea and aster to come through, goldenrod to come through, this is what I got: a backyard full of thousands of fireflies and monarchs and bees. So I want to ask all of you to think back on who taught you the love of plants and nature, and ask you who you're mentoring now. Because for all of those kids that don't know 10 animals and plants in their backyard, it's a great time to snap some beans and cook some meals together and save some of those bean seeds for next year and plant them together again next year. Because those are the connections that I think we've all been relearning are very important connections, both within our families as well as within our larger environment. So with that, I'll say I do have this new book out. It's been out about 8 months now. Kind of mind blown. It's in its 4th printing already, and it's available at your library, best place of all. You can get it online, you can get it at a local bookstore. And I hope you will love it. I hope you'll find yourself getting that. Also, I have a page on Facebook called The Heirloom Gardener, John Forti. And if you pop over to Facebook, just follow the page, and daily I put up at least one post on whatever is seasonal, traditional, or tied to a lot of the topics we've explored here tonight, but also tied in with a lot of inspiring garden knowledge and some beautiful art. And anyways, a fun place to come visit. And so with that, I'll say thank you very, very much for having me. And maybe we can open this up to some questions.
Yeah, I'm not seeing a lot of questions. I think that you provided us with an awful lot of information. Everybody's a lot of nice comments and thank yous in the chat, though. I want to say that I highly recommend, if you're on Facebook, to follow John's page, because just about every day you get something beautiful or inspiring or historical. It's just a real joy with all the other stuff that we're getting bombarded with every day, to have something nice to show up in your Facebook news feed every day. And for those of you, that were, John was talking about Michigan being such a great state for agriculture, and it is. And there's so many things that happen here that people aren't aware of, like that Michigan ranks #1 in the nation for the production of pickling cucumbers. So tons and tons of them, it's just an amazing, huge amount of pickling cucumbers are grown here. Same for pumpkins, and they also lead the nation, one of the biggest producers of dry beans. So, there's a lot of great things going on in Michigan. And I think John is on the East Coast, and I think we share a lot of similar, our climate is similar in a sense, because we're surrounded by the Great Lakes and he's closer to the ocean. We have a great gardening climate here. So, and also we share a lot of native plants. When you were mentioning all of the native plants, most of those are native to Michigan as well. Definitely the Eastern United States shares a lot of them. So hopefully I put the link to John's Facebook page in the chat, and you also have it up here. If you grab your camera and take a picture, you can have all of this contact information after the presentation's over. We will be, everyone who registered for the program will get a link in their email tomorrow to a rebroadcast of this, so you can go back, and if you missed anything, you can go back and rewatch it at your heart's content, at least for a couple of weeks. So we did have
maybe share it with some friends too.
Yes, definitely.
When you were talking about your state too, I'd also mention you have very active chapters of the Herb Society and garden clubs.
Yes.
And slow food, but also some of the best work in children's gardening out there as well. It really did a lot to help revitalize the children's gardens movement with folks like Jane Taylor. And it's just you should be proud of all that is actively going on there in horticulture and agriculture, because it really is changing. And I think sometimes when we lament whatever happened to American industry, we're just seeing it take new shape again, with generations of people who are actually doing a lot of what their great-great-grandparents did, but with a funky new twist on it and having some fun too.
We did get a question. Someone asks your advice about getting rid of deadly nightshade in her garden, or his garden.
Okay. Well, I will say that a lot of people just have common nightshade and fear that it's deadly nightshade. Either way, both are very easy to pull up. Their root systems are literally some of the smaller root systems out there. I just put on a pair of gloves for extra safety, and although I wouldn't worry that much, but it does, might as well. And if it's in the fruiting stage, don't throw it in your compost. But other than that, just pull it up when it's small and toss it in your compost pile, and as long as it's hot enough. But the main thing is to keep it from fruiting if you can possibly do that.
Yeah, definitely. If you can get anything before it goes to seeds, that's always the best way to get rid of weeds. Yeah. Okay, someone asks, can you recommend any other resources for those of us interested in historical gardening methods?
Sure. There's a great book that I showed in one of the images. It's by Judith Sumner, and it's called American Household Botany. And that really takes a look at so many of the traditional plants, both from the perspective of, why pickling worked from the scientific perspective, but also just good historical and modern knowledge around the same sorts of things. So that's one great book. There are several, it depends. If you're looking for organic, Elliot Coleman's a great resource for cold weather organic gardening. If you're looking for herbalism, people like Penelope Odie or Rosemary Gladstar, or there are a number of people writing on different topics included here, but those are just a few of my favorites that actually answered the question asked.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to collect this information and also put that in the email. So if I'll try to I'll look up that book and get the information to you. Well, someone asked a question, any food or medicine we can grow in shade and sun garden space?
Shade and sun?
Yeah, I guess that's kind of a broad question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I realized that after I wrote it. Simply, there's a garden space that we have that gets half-day sun and half-day shade.
I see. You can grow most anything in those instances. You could grow most greens. If you have deeper shade, also plants like sweet cicely, Solomon seal, chervil, some of the more flavorful herbs. And then as you move towards the sunnier edges, plant in things like your chives. And it depends if you want annual or perennial, but to me, I love mixing in edible herbs and perennial vegetables with my flower borders. When I was a kid, my grandfather would come and he'd plant tomatoes in between my mother's peonies, and which he called peonies, and eggplant in between her hosta, which he called funkia. And I thought he was a crazy old man, but I've turned into that same crazy old man because I love to watch. I mean, there's beauty in an eggplant flower and in the eggplant,
Yeah.
but you also get to eat it at the end. And who knew you can eat your hosta too? Those first shoots that come up are also, they call them mountain vegetable in Japan.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
We have another comment that that this person was transplanted from SoCal's farmers market and crop swap and happy about finding this group, starting with a small footprint. Yeah, if you are local to us here in the New Hudson, South Lyon area, definitely stop at the library because we do have a lot of programming, and we have our seed library. If you're not in this area and you're still in Michigan, look, if you go to the Michigan Seed Library Network and you look up on that website, there's a map of all the seed libraries in Michigan. Well, all the ones we know about anyway. There's about 120 of them now. So, definitely stop in your library or local seed library and connect with the people there and see what's going on in your area. So we have another question about indigenous and native gardening and farming. I know you touched on that. I'm not sure what exactly you're asking about, but we have some great books here at the library on the subject. But
And maybe I'll just dive in.
Yeah, John,
to
go ahead
say-
and elaborate.
Sure. I think these days, like so many things in a media-driven culture, we get buzzwords. And native plant is a great buzzword, but it also has a lot of depth of meaning. For me, though, I think sometimes we latch onto a good concept and we make it a little unrealistic for everybody. Like even the Three Sisters crops that I told you about, they came from the Southwest and moved across the nation. They weren't always where we live. Rosa rugosa, that I think of as our beach rose here on Cape Cod, that arrived in the 13th century. We don't know how, but pollen and seed analysis shows that it did. So to me, what is important isn't to get into the semantics as much as to find beauty in the native plants and try to do the underpinning of our plantings in the yard with some native oaks and some native fruiting plants and some beautiful perennials that become, if not the centerpiece of, at least the backdrop for all of the wildlife that wants those native plants to be present. Because, I've worked in public gardens where we've had trial gardens. And when we put out those, even nativars, as they are trying to call some of the new patented native plants that have been hybridized, 87%, I think, of them didn't have a bee on them. And then the straight native, anywhere in the vicinity would be covered. And that's really telling to me of why, your garden club's plant sale next weekend, I think it is going to be a really important thing because you're getting plants that weren't treated with neonics in a box store that's pretending to be a plant store, but they came from somebody who loves their garden and dug a piece of something meaningful, whether it's that it came from their great grandparents' rhubarb plant or a native patch of milkweed. They're all important in terms of biodiversity, but just like anything else that gets underrepresented, try to give native more of a fair shake in your yard when you plant and keep learning more about it.
Here's a great comment. Inspiring and informative, tied us to our past and encourage us to reinvent our future. You touched my heart. Thank you so much. Needed in our isolated and chaotic world.
Well, thank you. And that sounds like a great place to say thank you and good night, everybody.
Right,
It's been great spending time, and I hope you'll enjoy the book as much as the talk tonight. It's
All
great
right.
to be with you.
Thank you, John. And like I said, look for an email and I'll try to put some of these sources in that email. And thank you so much for coming tonight. We really appreciate you. We
Thank you
appreciate
very
John.
much.
Thank you,
you,
John.
everybody.
All right.
Thank
Pleasure.
you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night. Good night. Thank you.